The FBI searches President Biden's Wilmington home and finds 6 more classified documents in his possession. New Zealand has a new prime minister. A mass shooting at a Lunar New Year festival leaves 10 dead. And I talk about a scary experience that I had on Friday night and related thoughts about crime in America. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, it is January 24th, 2023. I hope that you had a great weekend and that you had a chance to watch Dennis and Julie yesterday on Monday. We are approaching our 1-year anniversary of Dennis and Julie. We started it back in March of 2022 out of my college dorm room. I was a senior in college at the time, and I would tell all my roommates to be quiet, and I would shut the door and do this podcast with Dennis. And now, of course, that I've graduated, we do it here in person, but we're coming up on the 1-year mark. So we need to get some champagne. Too bad Dennis doesn't drink, but oh well, I guess there'll just be more for me. So make sure to watch out for that 1-year anniversary special that's coming up in just a few weeks. And before we move on to news, I just want to quickly ask you one very serious question. Do you like this dress on me? I asked this because I was feeling confident today coming into the studio, and then someone who I work with, and I'm not going to name names, said that I look like a pumpkin in this dress and that, quote, Halloween is over. I guess they don't like the color orange on me, but I thought it was cute. And anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts on this controversy, and please take my side so I can go back to this certain coworker and stick it to him. Okay, now on to more serious things. Here are the news stories that you have to know today. First, unsurprisingly, there have been more classified documents found in the whole Biden document scandal. President Biden last week consented to the FBI searching his home in Wilmington, Delaware, in the wake of discoveries over the past few weeks of several classified documents. The FBI on Friday announced that it had found 6 more of these documents in President Biden's home. These specific documents, according to President Biden's personal attorney, dates back to his time as vice president and his tenure in the United States Senate. These documents and where specifically they are found is being passed along to Special Counsel Robert Hur, who was appointed by U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland to investigate Biden's possession of these materials. And the investigation into Trump's possession of documents is still ongoing and being led by Special Counsel John Smith. So we will keep you updated as both of those investigations continue on. In other news, New Zealand has a new prime minister, Chris Hipkins of Hutt Valley. Last week, the former Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, announced after 5 years of leading the country that she would step down from her position and not seek re-election, citing that she no longer has the energy required to do the job. Many people believe, though, that Ms. Ardern is stepping down not because of the fact that she doesn't have the energy, but because she lacks popularity to win the next election. She has been widely criticized for her government spending, which has contributed to inflation and economic downturn in New Zealand. And she's also been primarily criticized for her response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Although New Zealand did see one of the lowest rates of infection and the lowest death rates across the world as a result of the virus, it had quite harsh lockdowns and quarantine requirements. Ms. Ardern also raised some eyebrows back in 2021 when she said a controversial statement about free speech, arguing that the New Zealand government is the unique arbiter and source of truth.
You can trust us as a source of that information. You can also trust the Director General of Health and the Ministry of Health. covid19.govt.nz. Otherwise, dismiss anything else. We will continue to be your single source of truth. We will provide information frequently. We will share everything we can, everything else you see, a grain of salt. And when you see those messages, remember that unless you hear it from us, it is not the truth.
The new Prime Minister, Mr. Hipkins, is the leader of the left-wing Labour Party. He was the former COVID-19 Minister of New Zealand while Ms. Ardern was in office, and he now oversees the nation's education, police, and public service portfolios. He is seen to be more of a centrist than his predecessor, but that remains to be seen since, again, he was head of the COVID-19 response. And specifically, people are focusing on how Mr. Hipkins will prepare his country's military should China invade Taiwan. China, over the past couple weeks, has been stepping up its airplane surveillance tests over Taiwan, so it remains to be seen how he will handle that issue. Now, in the biggest news story of the day, we're going to talk about the mass shooting that happened outside of Los Angeles this past weekend. On Saturday night, January 21st, at close to 10:30 p.m., a man opened fire at Star Dance Studio, a ballroom dance hall in Monterey Park, California, that was hosting a Lunar New Year's Eve party. This week, we're going to post a 5-minute video on the significance and the history of the Lunar New Year. But just to give you a quick primer, the Lunar New Year is a holiday that is celebrated in East and Southeast Asia that originated in China. And it commences annually on the first new moon between January 21st and February 20th. A new moon is essentially the opposite of a full moon when there is a dark sky and there's no moon visible. The celebration then continues for 15 days until the next full moon. This holiday commemorates the start of the New Year's new lunar cycle, and each year is associated with a different animal. This year is the year of the rabbit, but in Vietnam, they're celebrating it as the year of the cat, which again, we are going to get into in the 5-minute video. But this is just to say that Lunar New Year is perhaps the most important event of the year for many Asians. And Monterey Park is a city with a high Asian population. In fact, 65% of the 61,000 residents of that city are Asian American. And thousands were out this weekend celebrating the holiday. The suspect was 72-year-old Hu Can Tran, who opened fire on the ballroom, killing 10 people, 5 men and 5 women, all believed to have been in their 50s and 60s, and injuring 10 others. About 20 minutes after this attack, Tran drove a few miles to another ballroom studio celebrating the Lunar New Year called the Lai Lai Ballroom in Alhambra, California. And 26-year-old Brandon Tsay was standing at the doorway when Tran walked in with his weapon. And Mr. Tsay recognized that this person was an attacker and was going to cause a lot of harm. And he valiantly engaged in a struggle with Tran and took away his gun. So let's hear from this hero, Brandon Tsay, how he recounted this moment.
When I got the courage, I lunged at him with both my hands, grabbed the weapon, and we had a struggle. We struggled into the lobby, trying to get this gun away from each other. He was hitting me across the face, bashing the back of my head. I was trying to use my elbows to separate the gun away from him, creating some distance. Finally, at one point, I was able to pull the gun away from him, shove him aside, create some distance, point the gun at him, intimidate him, shout at him and say, "Get the hell out of here. I'll shoot. Get away. Go." And at this point, I thought he would run away, but he was just standing there contemplating whether to fight or to run away. I really thought I would have to shoot him if he came at me. This is when he turned around and walked out the door, jogged back to his van.
After he was saying, or as he was saying, after that, Hu Can Tran fled the scene. And on Sunday, the police engaged in an hours-long manhunt until they found him hiding out in a van in Torrance that was parked in a shopping plaza about 30 miles away from the Star Dance Studio. When law enforcement surrounded his car, the suspect shot himself and died. Now, this event is the largest mass shooting in California in several years. According to the mass shooting tracker site, by the way, a mass shooting is defined as a shooting where 4 or more people are shot. This event, like most shootings, was a case of intra-racial crime, meaning crime that within a certain racial group, where the suspect was Asian and he targeted other Asians. This is true of most crime in America, both on a large scale and a small scale. People tend to target those that are in their racial category. However, there are two things that make this mass shooting a bit of an anomaly from others that we have seen. First, it's unusual to see a shooter who is this old. As mentioned, the suspect in this shooting was 72 years old. For reference, 6 of the 9 deadliest mass shooters in the United States since 2018 were 21 or younger. For instance, the school shooting that happened in last May in Uvalde, Texas, the shooter was 18 years old. In 2021, there was a supermarket mass shooting in Boulder, Colorado, and the perpetrator was 21. In 2018, there was a famous school shooting in Santa Fe, Texas, where the shooter was 17. And then, also in 2018, the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School shooter in Parkland, Florida, was 19 years old. So again, it's a bit odd to see a shooter who is not in that young age range. The second thing is that it's also unusual, quite frankly, to see a shooter who is Asian. If you look at the homicide figures in the United States, Black people are about 13% of the population and constitute about 51% of murder perpetrators in this country. White people are about 61% of the population and constitute about 45% of the murder perpetrators. And Asians are 6% of the population and constitute 1% of the murder perpetrators. We are not yet aware of a motive of this particular shooter, but we will continue to cover this story as more information comes out. Now, speaking of crime, I want to tell you a personal story about something that happened on Friday night that I've been thinking about and wanting to share with you. And it has to do with the broader issue of crime in America. So I was invited to go to a dinner on Friday night, and I was in charge of bringing wine to this dinner. And the dinner started at 7 o'clock, and it was about 6:30, and I was still working in my apartment when I realized, oh my gosh, I have to go to the store, get this wine, and go to the dinner. So I hurried out of my apartment, and I drove about a mile away to a local grocery store to get this wine. Again, it wasn't late at night. It was about 6:30 or 6:40, but the store was pretty much empty since it was Friday and people were probably out partying or at home resting. So I was one of about maybe 8 people in the store. So I go over, I get the wine, I go to the cash register, and there's only one cash register that is open at this time of night. And there are about 3 people waiting in front of me. And out of the corner of my eye, I see this homeless man who has this big long beard that's down to his belly button. He looks quite filthy and he's murmuring things to himself. And so, he's on my radar, but he doesn't look that menacing. So I'm just kind of keeping him in my peripheral vision, but staying in the checkout line. And then all of a sudden, he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out this small little switch knife. And he was opening it and shutting it and opening it and shutting it. And he was pacing about 5 feet and then turning around and continuing to pace back and forth. So obviously I take notice of this. The other people in the checkout line with me take notice of this, and we're all kind of saying to each other, should we leave? What's going to happen here? This is clearly quite scary. And we decided to stay because he would kind of walk away a few aisles down, so we figured that he was far away enough where it wasn't a threat. But then when he would walk back towards us, all of us got this terror because he was just a few feet away from us. And if he decided that he wanted to harm us, he could very easily do so. And as dramatic as this sounds, I really did in that moment fear for my life. I thought, oh my gosh, again, if he decides to lunge towards me, he could seriously hurt me. And so thankfully the checkout line was moving fast. I decided to stay, and keeping in mind that I could bolt at any moment if he made any step towards me. But as I was walking out of the store manager was there at the front on the phone. I was presuming that she was calling the police. And I walked up to her and I said, oh my gosh, this is terrifying. This is so awful that this man is in here. Is there anything that you guys can do about it? And she said, We see people coming into the store all of the time, engaging in menacing behavior. And she said, there's nothing that we can do about it. We call the police and the police just tells us, I'm sorry, we can't prioritize you. We have other violent crimes that we have to go pursue. And we are short-staffed and we are underfunded, so we can't come to your store and help you. And I just have to tell you, it made me so mad because I thought, I'm really lucky that I spend most of my day either at work, in my apartment, or in my car. That's basically it. But this woman who seemed to be, I'm 23 years old, she seemed to be about 5 or 7 years older than I am. She works at this store. I've seen her there before. She works the night shifts, and she has to stay in that store when people like that homeless man with the knife come in, and she has to essentially at times put her life at risk in her job. And it just made me think that this crime stuff that's going on in this country is so disgusting and sick. And it bothers me so much when we see leaders talking about how much they care about minorities. This manager that I was talking to, it shouldn't even matter to the story that she was a minority, but she was. And most of the people who are working in managerial roles at these stores or working as cashiers are lower income and are disproportionately minority. And they are the ones that have to encounter these criminals and these unsafe people that come into their stores as a result of these crazy anti-police policies that we have seen infect our country over the past 2 years. And it is just so awful to think that people sit in the Sacramento conference rooms at our state capitol or in classrooms around the country, and they can sit and pontificate about how we have a carceral state and we have to get more police off the street and get more criminals out of prison, but they are not the ones who are affected by the policies. Again, people who are disproportionately low income and disproportionately minority are the ones who are put at risk. And so when you hear people nowadays talking about how the defund the police movement was just a fad, it wasn't that big of a deal, they are not being honest. And this has motivated me to do some more research and set some facts straight so all of us can know this and counter argue when certain individuals tell us that we are over exaggerating when we talk about crime. So this first fact that I want to tell you is that every single police department in the United States was defunded in major cities, okay? LA, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Seattle, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Baltimore, all of the major cities in the United States had massive million-dollar budget cuts to their police department. Here in Los Angeles, for instance, in 2020, the LA City Council voted to defund the LA Police Department by $150 million. And then a year later, in 2021, when crime rose by 30 to 40%, they decided to reverse that and vote back in to refund the police, and they voted to increase the police budget by 12%, that's $213 million, for the 2022-2023 fiscal year. And this is a trend that we did see across these major cities. They would defund and then refund, but the defunding did happen. And what people don't understand is that just because they refunded many of these police departments doesn't mean that there wasn't colossal damage done. And one of the biggest things that we saw as a result of those defunding was massive police retirements and shortages, which continue to haunt us and inform the massive crime that we see nowadays in our big cities. There was actually a New York Times story, of all places, about this back in June of 2021. And this story reported that there was a survey of about 200 police departments across the United States. And they found that retirements went up 45% and resignations went up 18% in just 1 year. From April 2020 to April 2021, we saw that big of a spike in retirements and in resignations. The NYPD, for instance, in the year 2021, saw a 75% increase alone in retirements. And just about a few weeks ago, at the beginning of 2023, the NYPD announced that it had a shortfall of 4,000 police officers. And this is just not a problem that's confined to the NYPD. I'm citing statistics from there because it's one of the most famous and well-known police departments, and crime is obviously extremely rampant in New York City. But if you look at a place like Minneapolis, for example, which is, of course, the police department that oversaw the brutal protests in the wake of the tragic death of George Floyd, they have 100 fewer officers than their city charter requires. And the Tucson, Arizona Police Department also recently announced that it has the fewest amount of officers since the 1970s. So this is just not a regional problem. This is affecting the country writ large. And in addition to these police retirements and shortages, we have also seen many new initiatives and laws come into play in the past 2 years as sort of an aftermath of the defund the police movement. And one of the biggest pushes that we have seen is to eliminate bail. And it has started from these bail organizations, such as the Seattle Northwest Bail Fund, obviously, that is in the city of Seattle. And it's a nonprofit organization that takes the donations from the public and it allocates it towards criminals' bail funds to get them out of jail. And so on their website, they list the criteria for how they decide which criminals to release from jail. And interestingly, they say that they take gender and race into account when considering who to release. But they do not mention taking a previous criminal record into account. Shouldn't it be the case that if someone has been convicted of assault or robbery, they should stay in jail, and that should not be a person who the Seattle Northwest Bail Fund should give money towards getting them out? But no, according to them, gender and race matters more. And this bail fund, it was just set up about 1.5 years or 2 years ago. It has already released hundreds of criminals that have been accused of, among other things, child rape, death threats, violent burglaries, and assault with a deadly weapon. Another bail fund that everyone should know about is the Minnesota Freedom Fund. Back in 2020, this fund was established to bail out Black Lives Matter rioters who were rioting in Minnesota. And Kamala Harris, our VP, actually publicized this bail fund and encouraged many of her constituents to donate to it, which they did. This bail fund raised $35 million within just a few weeks in the summer of 2020. And there were about 10 rioters that were arrested and were bailed out as a result of this fund. There were only 10 because so many of the rioters didn't get arrested. But again, the bail fund got those 10 out of jail, but there was still millions and millions and millions of dollars left over that this bail fund raised. So guess where it went to? It went to people who were accused of, among other things, rape and murder. For example, $100,000 of this money went to one woman who was charged with stabbing her friend to death, and $350,000 went to a man convicted of rape, and he was previously charged with kidnapping and sexual assault. By the way, I just want to point out to you, these are the same people who talk about Me Too and believing women and defending women. And if they really care so much about sexual assault, why are they allowing these bail funds to give money to people who have been accused of sexual assault so they can go back on the street and continue to engage in that disgusting, despicable behavior? So it's not just these funds, although they're in almost every state in the country that are contributing to getting these criminals out of jail. There have actually been many laws that have been passed in the past 2 years in certain states that get rid, in some cases, of the cash bail system completely. I've reported on the fact that Illinois, starting on January 1st, 2023, is the first state to eliminate the bail system altogether. Now, it is true that for a small select number of violent crimes, such as murder, a judge is allowed to issue a dangerousness order that makes that person being accused of murder have to stay in jail. But for a litany of other crimes, violent crimes, Now in Illinois, people, when they're arrested, do not have to stay in jail and pay bail. They just get released onto the street pending their trial. So that is one very clear, stark example of the effects of this defund the police movement. New York State has also seen a similar thing with eliminating cash bail. In New York City, like Illinois, there are several crimes for which criminals do not have to stay in jail and pay bail. There have also been several overhauls of criminal codes, big and small, across the country. I reported last week that DC has proposed to overhaul its criminal code that has been in place since 1901. They want to significantly decrease maximum sentencing, and they want to get rid of mandatory minimum sentencing for crimes altogether. And it looks like the city council is going to pass this into law. The mayor of DC actually vetoed this, but again, it seems like the city council is going to override it. Also, some more anecdotal examples, but again, just to illustrate how widespread this is, in Riverside County, California, the Supreme Court of Riverside in December 2022 dropped over 1,000 criminal cases that were awaiting trial because they cited that they did not have enough resources to hear all of these criminal cases. So just 1,000 criminals are out on the street now in Riverside. Additionally, starting on January 1st, 2023, the state of California passed SB 731, which is a law that expunges the criminal records of about 250,000 people. So when they apply to a job or when they apply to live in an apartment, for instance, and the job or the landlord requires them to have a background check, their crimes will not show up on their background check. And the California Department of Corrections recently announced that they are closing 2 prisons in California and deactivating 6 others as part of their attempt to de-incarcerate much of the California population. So this is all to say that this is not just a fad that happened in 2020. This continues to infect our systems every single day. And again, what is sickening about all of this is that it is not the wealthy people who live on the Upper East Side in their apartments or live behind their gates in Brentwood who are bearing the brunt of this. It is everyday, working class, blue collar citizens, overwhelmingly minority. So just remember, when you are going to the polls, there was one party that is behind all of these measures, and there is one party that is trying to oppose them. Thank you for joining us today. And until next time, we should all remember that each of our thoughts, choices, and actions shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. See you tomorrow.